In the heart of Atlanta, a tragedy unfolded that no one could have imagined. In a small, unassuming apartment, an act so horrific occurred that it would forever change the lives of all who heard about it. A mother's actions led to the unthinkable, the deaths of her two young sons. But what could drive someone to such unimaginable cruelty? What led to this heartbreaking moment in an Atlanta home? This was not just a crime, it was a tragedy that shook an entire community to its core. The questions remain: what happened inside that apartment, and why? Welcome to CrimeByte, where we uncover the darkest corners of real-life crime. Today, we delve into a story of betrayal, heartbreak, and the search for answers. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell for more gripping true crime stories. Also remember to like, comment, and share this video. In this episode, we bring you the haunting story of Lamora Williams, a mother whose actions shocked Atlanta and left the nation grappling with the question, how could this happen? Prepare to witness a tale of despair, betrayal, and the unrelenting pursuit of justice. This is the story of a tragedy that could have been prevented, and the lives it left shattered. Lamora Williams lived a life defined by struggle. Born and raised in Atlanta, she had dreams of a stable life for herself and her children. But behind the walls of this small apartment, those dreams began to crumble. Lamora grew up in a world of instability, shaped by a fractured family and limited opportunities. As an adult, she carried the weight of her past, but her greatest source of hope came in the form of her children. As a single mother, Lamora fought to provide for her kids, but the challenges she faced were mounting: long hours, financial strain, and the relentless pressures of parenting alone. For many, this would have been overwhelming, but for Lamora it was something more. Lamora displayed signs of severe mental health struggles, the psychologist explains. Depression, anxiety, and possibly more. Without support, these issues can compound, leading to devastating outcomes. Neighbors recall seeing Lamora exhausted, overwhelmed, and at times desperate for help. But for a mother in her position, help was hard to come by. Her struggles weren't just financial. Friends described her as increasingly isolated, unable to reach out for the support she desperately needed. And while the world outside her apartment continued as normal, inside, her reality was unraveling. Was Lamora's life spiraling out of control, or were there deeper cracks in her reality? The line between hardship and crisis was becoming blurred, and the consequences were looming. In the days leading up to the tragedy, the cracks in Lamora's world widened. Financial struggles, isolation, and the relentless pressures of single motherhood began to converge in a way no one could have anticipated. Neighbors noticed her growing agitation. One described hearing arguments late at night, the sound of raised voices echoing through the walls. Another recalled seeing Lamora sitting on her porch, her face blank, her eyes distant. Her financial struggles had reached a breaking point. With bills piling up and no steady source of income, Lamora was barely holding on. And with no one to share her burden, the weight grew heavier by the day. To outsiders, Lamora's life may have seemed manageable, but beneath the surface, the pressure was building. Every setback, every sleepless night, every cry for help that went unanswered, it all added to a storm that was ready to explode. Isolation can be one of the most dangerous aspects of a struggling mind. For Lamora, it wasn't just financial hardship. It was the growing belief that no one could understand or help her. And in those moments of solitude, her thoughts turned darker. In the days before the tragedy, Lamora's frustration became palpable. Phone calls to friends turned into arguments, and her once cheerful interactions with neighbors grew cold. The isolation was complete, and the storm was about to break. What happens when stress, isolation, and despair collide? For Lamora, the pressure was building, and the consequences would be devastating. October 2017. Inside this unassuming apartment in Atlanta, a scene of unimaginable horror was about to unfold. For Lamora Williams, the weight of isolation and despair had reached its breaking point. And in a single night, her actions would cross a line no one thought possible. Neighbors later described hearing loud voices coming from Lamora's apartment that evening. Shouts, followed by silence, then the unmistakable cries of young children. But what was happening behind those closed doors was far worse than anyone could have imagined. In that moment, something inside Lamora snapped. The overwhelming pressure of her life, the isolation, the financial strain, the constant demands, culminated in a single, incomprehensible act. She placed her two youngest children, Jakarta and Kayante, into the oven and turned it on. Investigators would later determine that the children died from prolonged heat exposure. The details of what happened that night remain chilling, a testament to the depths of Lamora's desperation and the fragility of her mental state. By the time the horrific act was over, the apartment had fallen silent. The cries of the children were gone, replaced by an eerie stillness that hung in the air. But the tragedy didn't end there. In a moment of unimaginable darkness, Lamora's actions crossed the line no one thought possible. But why did she do it? Was it a cry for help that went unanswered, or something far more sinister? After the tragedy, Lamora did something no one expected. She called the children's father, showing him the horrific scene in her apartment. The call would become a critical moment in the unfolding investigation, a glimpse into the unimaginable horror of that night. "She called me," the children's father would later tell investigators, his voice heavy with emotion. "She showed me the boys and she said, 'This is what you made me do.'" For the father, the call was a moment of unimaginable pain, a horrifying glimpse into the tragedy that had unfolded. But it was also a turning point. Within moments, he contacted the police, setting the investigation into motion. When officers arrived, they were met with a scene of devastation. The apartment was silent, the air heavy with the weight of what had occurred. Inside, they discovered the bodies of Jakarta and Kayante, evidence of a tragedy beyond comprehension. "It was one of the hardest cases I've ever worked," the officer says, his expression somber. "You can't prepare for something like this. It stays with you." Lamora was taken into custody that night, her demeanor calm but distant. To investigators, her behavior raised even more questions. Why would she call the one person who could expose her darkest secret? Was it guilt or something else entirely? When police arrived at the scene, they were met with a silence that was almost deafening. The weight of what had happened inside that apartment pressed down on everyone present. For detectives, the challenge was clear. Piece together a story that defied comprehension. Inside, officers discovered the bodies of Jakarta and Kayante, their tiny forms a haunting reminder of the lives lost. The initial reports described signs of extreme heat exposure, a detail that left even seasoned investigators shaken. This wasn't just a crime, it was a nightmare, the detective says. "We knew from the start that this case would haunt everyone involved, but our job was to find out what led to this and to make sure justice was served." Lamora's initial story was one of deflection. She claimed that she had left her children with a babysitter and returned to find them dead. But as detectives dug deeper, inconsistencies in her story began to emerge. There was no sign of a babysitter, the detective explains. No neighbors saw anyone enter or leave the apartment that night, and Lamora's phone records showed no calls or messages to anyone who could verify her story. As the investigation progressed, the truth began to take shape. Lamora's story of a babysitter unraveled under scrutiny, leaving only one explanation. She had been alone with her children that night. Detectives were left to unravel a story filled with contradictions, lies, and the unthinkable truth. What had driven Lamora to commit such an act? And could there have been any warning signs? By the end of the investigation, the evidence was clear. Lamora Williams had acted alone, committing an act that defied comprehension. But even as the case moved forward, the questions lingered. Questions that would haunt the community and investigators alike. When the news broke, it sent shockwaves through Atlanta. A mother had committed an act so horrific, so unimaginable, that it left an entire community grappling with questions they couldn't answer. "She seemed overwhelmed," one neighbor says. "I knew she had a lot on her plate, but I never imagined something like this could happen." None of us did. "This tragedy has shaken us to our core," he says. "It's a reminder of how important it is to check on one another, to lend a hand when we see someone struggling. We failed these children, and we have to do better." As the story spread, the nation joined Atlanta in mourning. But alongside the grief came anger and disbelief. How could such a tragedy happen in their midst? And could it have been prevented? "We knew she was struggling," the family member says, "but we didn't know it was this bad. If we had known, maybe we could have done something. Maybe we could have stopped it." This case raised important questions about mental health, support for single mothers, and the resources available to families in crisis. For many, it was a wake-up call. a stark reminder of the cracks in the system that can lead to unthinkable outcomes. How could such a tragedy happen in their midst? Could it have been prevented? For the community, these questions remain unanswered, a painful echo of the lives lost and the lessons yet to be learned. March 2024. After years of investigation and preparation, the trial of Lamora Williams began. The nation watched as a case filled with unimaginable tragedy unfolded in a courtroom. Was this the story of a mother broken by her circumstances, or a calculated act of cruelty? The evidence is clear, the prosecutor begins, her tone resolute. Lamora Williams committed a heinous act, one that robbed two innocent children of their lives. This was not an accident, nor was it a momentary lapse. It was a deliberate act of violence. The prosecution's case was methodical, built on a mountain of evidence that left little room for doubt. But while the facts of the crime were clear, the question of why loomed over the proceedings. This is not the story of a monster, the defense attorney declares. This is the story of a woman who was failed by every system that should have protected her. Lamora Williams suffered from untreated mental illness, a fact that cannot be ignored. She exhibited clear signs of severe depression, anxiety, and psychosis, the psychologist explains. These conditions, left untreated, can distort reality and impair judgment. In Lamora's case, the evidence suggests a complete mental break. "I lost my sons," he says, his voice breaking. "They were just babies, and now they're gone forever. I can't understand how or why this happened, but they didn't deserve this." As the trial progressed, each testimony painted a clearer picture of the tragedy, but not everyone agreed on what that picture meant. Was Lamora a victim of her own mind, or a mother who had made a monstrous choice? Ladies and gentlemen, we cannot ignore the severity of this crime. Whatever her circumstances, Lamora Williams took the lives of her own children. Justice demands accountability. We ask you to consider her state of mind. This is not about excusing her actions, but about understanding them. Lamora Williams was failed by the very systems meant to protect her, and her children paid the ultimate price. After weeks of testimony, the fate of Lamora Williams was now in the hands of the jury. But even as the trial neared its end, the questions persisted. Was this a case of justice or something more complicated? After days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the foreperson stood, their words heavy with finality. "Guilty," the foreperson declares. On all counts, the verdict was clear, but the sentencing was yet to come. For the families of Jakarta and Keontae, justice was not just about punishment. It was about acknowledgement, about ensuring that their loss was never forgotten. This court recognizes the severity of this crime, the judge begins. The loss of two innocent lives is a tragedy that cannot be overstated. Lamora Williams is hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For some, the sentence marked the end of a nightmare, a measure of justice for the lives lost. But for others, it raised new questions about the systems that had failed both Lamora and her children. This case highlights the importance of addressing mental health, one expert says. It's not just about punishment, it's about understanding the factors that lead to these tragedies and preventing them in the future. "My sons deserve better," he says, his voice breaking. "This won't bring them back, but I hope it brings some kind of closure. And I hope it makes people pay attention to the warning signs before it's too late." For Lamora Williams, the sentence marked the end of her story. But for the community, the questions remain. Could this tragedy have been prevented? And how do we ensure that no family faces such devastation again? This case was not just about Lamora Williams. It was about a system that failed her and her children. A system that overlooked warning signs, ignored cries for help, and left a mother spiraling into darkness. Lamora's story is, unfortunately, not unique, one expert explains. We see so many single parents struggling to make ends meet, often battling mental health issues with little to no support. The resources are stretched thin, and people fall through the cracks. Lamora faced the impossible task of raising 4 children alone, with no stable income and limited access to mental health care. For many like her, the daily struggles can feel insurmountable, leading to desperation, and in this case, tragedy. Single parents, especially mothers, are often left to navigate a maze of challenges without a map. Financial instability, lack of affordable childcare, and the stigma surrounding mental health create a perfect storm of isolation and stress. We need to ask ourselves hard questions, the the advocate says. What resources are we providing to struggling families? How do we make mental health care accessible? And how do we ensure that no one feels they have to face these challenges alone? Was Lamora's tragedy preventable? Could earlier intervention have saved her children's lives? These are the questions that haunt this case, and the answers lie in addressing the systemic issues that allowed this to happen. For every Lamora Williams, there are countless others on the brink of similar devastation. Families trapped in cycles of poverty and neglect, with nowhere to turn. How many more lives will be lost before real change is made? In the wake of such darkness, we are left with one question. How do we shine a light on those who need help the most? The story of Lamora Williams is a tragedy, but it can also be a catalyst for change. This case has ignited conversations about the importance of supporting vulnerable families. From increasing access to mental health care to creating safety nets for single parents, the path forward is clear, but it requires action from all of us. I was where Lamora was, she says. I felt like I had no way out, but I found help, and it saved my life and my children's lives. We need to make sure every parent knows they're not alone. Through awareness, education, and compassion, we can create a world where no one feels they have to face these challenges alone. A world where tragedies like this one can be prevented before they begin. This is not just a story of loss, it's a call to action, a reminder that we all have a role to play in building a stronger, more compassionate community. Because every life is worth saving, and every family deserves a chance to thrive. As we close this chapter, we are left with a mixture of sorrow, anger, and reflection. The story of Lamora Williams is one that demands we examine the cracks in our systems, the unspoken struggles of mental health, and the devastating impact of isolation. It's a tragedy that reminds us how fragile life can be, and how much we as a society need to do to protect it. For Jakarta and Kayante, the innocence of childhood was stolen too soon. For their father, their siblings, and the community, the pain of their loss is a wound that may never fully heal. But their story cannot end here, not in silence. It must live on as a call to action, a plea for change, and a reminder of the importance of compassion and vigilance. This documentary is not just about revisiting the past, it's about shaping the future. Together, we have the power to ensure that no other family suffers a similar fate. By recognizing the warning signs, advocating for stronger support systems, and fostering a culture of empathy, we can make a difference. Thank you for watching this CrimeByte documentary. These stories are more than just headlines. They are lives, voices, and legacies. If you found this story compelling, like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let your voice be part of the conversation, because together we can spark the change that is so desperately needed. As we sign off, we leave you with this question. How will you honor the lives of those lost? Will you stand with us to build a better future? Remember, it's not just about telling these stories, it's about learning from them. Stay safe, stay aware, and stay with us as we continue to uncover the truths that need to be told.